Okay, welcome. This is Miss Hadi. I'm going to show you a little bit about Byzantine economy and society today. I want you to have your book open on the left and the lecture open on the right. First thing I want to teach you is that the economy back then was largely uh, um depended on, or a big part of the economy was agriculture, so people farming. And that's not really mentioned in the lecture, but you can see it over here in the book. So I want you to pay attention to what's in the book that's not in the lecture. The other thing I want you to do is to strike economical from your vocabulary. Economical is a word, but we use it for things that are cheap or of good value. In this class, we're only going to say things that are economic. Now, I'm only going to do this first section in this video. So I'm going to talk to you about, agriculture and the free peasantry and the theme system, but I'm going to stop at industry and trade and do another video for that because otherwise I'll run out of time. So really quickly, this first section is the opener for the economic part. And it's basically going to tell you that, the Byzantine Empire was the eastern part of the Roman Empire that continued after the collapse of the western part of the Roman Empire. And that because of that, not everything disappeared that existed during the Roman Empire. Instead, some things continued. And for example, some of the agricultural foundations are going to continue and be a big reason why the Byzantine Empire does so well. Anyway, so that's not in your lecture. Just know that there's a continuity there. And then it starts to talk about agriculture, which is not mentioned at all, really, in your lecture. So pay attention to that. Agriculture should go under the economic part of your inspect chart. It tells you that Egypt was a major source of grain for Byzantium before it was conquered by the Islamic Arab forces. And then after Egypt was taken, instead they started to get their grain from Anatolia and the lower Danube. And it talks about other lands that they received their agriculture from, that were parts of their breadbasket. Sorry if I'm not making sense. I'm a little bit sick, but hopefully you guys get the gist of this. But basically, it's talking about Egypt. It's talking about Anatolia, how they were breadbaskets, which means a source of grain, and how all of that helped to support larger populations at bigger cities, including at Constantinople, which had a population that approached about 1 million people, which was really big for a city back then. And here you can see that on the lecture. Then it starts to talk about the peasantry. You can see it in the marginal note on the side. And it basically says the Byzantine Empire did best when the free peasants were doing well. Okay, so the peasants were trying to find ways to have a little bit of land to cultivate and improve their family's circumstances or their fortunes. But the wealthy people of Byzantium kept trying to find ways to accumulate more wealth, which is land at that time. And they kept trying to take all the land for themselves, and it was really hard for the peasants. The peasants weren't quite slaves, but they weren't quite completely free either. And sometimes it was really hard for the peasants because they often had to work land under what's called a sharecropping arrangement. And they basically weren't, um, you know, wealthy enough to really be independent. Yes, and so that's what that's saying here. We have talks about the peasants, and then it talks about how the peasants are going to benefit when the wealthy are going to have some of their large land holdings destroyed by invasions in the 6th and 7th century. And this paragraph talks about that. Then it starts to talk about the theme system, which I told you about in class. The theme system, if you remember, was when generals were given land and they were supposed to take that land and give it to peasants in exchange for military service. And that has a bunch of wonderful consequences. Like it makes the peasants better off because now they have land, and it also makes for a stronger military to fight against the Muslims. Okay, so it tells you about that. It tells you what the Byzantine government did to try to limit the wealth of the wealthy, but that over the long run, the wealthy landowners found ways to create larger and larger estates and turn the peasants back into a dependent class. And that's bad for a couple of reasons. It's going to have not just financial implications, but also military implications. So, for example, people that owned large estates, the wealthy, found ways to get around paying their taxes, whereas the poor people didn't usually do that. They just paid their taxes, whereas the wealthy found concessions and exemptions. The other problem is when the wealthy kept the land and didn't recirculate it in through the theme system, you have less land available to be given to the poor. So you have less people being recruited in the military. So you have a weaker military. So that's another problem. The other problem is that sometimes these large landholders made their own armies and used it against the imperial government. So all of this is going to weaken the Byzantine state and cause problems. In the next video I make for you guys, I'm going to talk about industry and trade. Hopefully that helped you understand the beginning part of this section and about the demise of the Thebes system. Thanks.